Well, let's stay with the war in Gaza now for our perspective interview this morning. And with the war still in full swing, we're going to zoom out a little bit now and ask, does Israel have a plan for the day after? What might Gaza look like once this intense fighting has subsided? Well, with me live now is the researcher Rob Geist Pinfold. He's a lecturer in peace and security at Durham University in the UK. He's also the author of a new book called Understanding Territorial Withdrawal, Israeli Occupations and Exits. Good to have you on the programme, sir. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's been 6 weeks then since that deadly Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th. And very quickly after that, the Israeli government was clear it would respond militarily. It began with aerial bombardments. Obviously, now we have the ground war as well. And I wonder, first of all, take us back to those early days. Do we have a sense that the Israeli generals, that the Israeli politicians had a plan for how long they would go in and perhaps what victory for them might look like?
In short, no. And that's what's really shocking. It shows you just how Israel was surprised and didn't expect this, how much of an intelligence failure those attacks on October the 7th are. You would expect that the Israeli government, in conjunction working with the top brass of the Israeli army, would have a kind of oven-ready plan for what to do in the eventuality of a mass attack by Hamas within Israel's borders. The fact that it took Israel so long to launch a ground invasion is actually a product and represents that lack of consensus at the heart of government. Now, we know that many in the IDF were kind of calling for a shock and awe invasion, very sort of rapid land, sea and air attack to go in and basically go straight into these urban areas within the Gaza Strip, like Gaza City. The political establishment, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, were much more reluctant to agree to that kind of model. And indeed, the Biden administration was also leaning on the Israelis, saying, look, we will back your ground invasion. We will basically do our best to prevent calls for a ceasefire from becoming particularly strong. Nevertheless, you need to tell us what your plan is here and what your plan is for the day after Hamas, if you are able to remove Hamas from power. And the lack of those answers, the fact that the US, A, couldn't get answers from the Israelis, and B, when they didn't like the answers that they were getting, that was another reason why the ground invasion took place significantly later than many analysts, including myself, predicted would happen. And it really shows that the Israelis were not ready for this and they didn't have a plan to respond.
And as I say, it's been more than 6 weeks now since that all unfolded. Are we now any clearer as to what the Israelis plan to do in Gaza? There have been some suggestions, for example, that they might reoccupy a part of the Strip.
Yeah, there's been different perspectives from various government ministers. You've heard at the very start of the war, Eli Cohen, Israel's foreign minister, saying the borders of Gaza would shrink, not just suggesting then an occupation, but actually an annexation, that Israel would actually take some parts of the Gaza Strip for itself. But you then had, under pressure from the Biden administration, Netanyahu come out and say there will be no reoccupation. At the same time, there are ministers at the heart of government saying that Israel should re-establish settlements in the Gaza Strip that it removed in 2005. So again, it represents that lack of consensus at the heart of government. But we are seeing something, I guess, coming to formation, a new status quo in that Israel is slowly but surely extending its control over the Gaza Strip, trying to stay out of these urban areas for too long, but at the same time taking and holding operationally valuable parts of the territory. The question is, who takes over the civilian parts of the Gaza Strip? Israel has shown zero desire to basically be the bureaucrat, to be responsible for the day-to-day civilian affairs in the territory, health, education, policing and whatnot. But that means someone else has to do it. Now, Israel has said we don't want the Palestinian Authority to do it. They've also said we'll reject an international force. And that leaves very much an open question of, what comes next? Will Israel's reluctance or refusal to allow anyone else into the Gaza Strip mean we actually have a post-war status quo that looks a lot like the pre-war status quo? Israel having some kind of territorial buffer zone, whilst Hamas basically is able to reassert control and power within the civilian parts of the Gaza Strip simply because there's a power vacuum that Israel's failed to fill.
That's really interesting. And I suppose one idea that could lead into that would be that even if Hamas can be militarily defeated in this war, there's another question as to whether or not Israel will be safer having done so, because it does seem like, because of the scale of the suffering that is being inflicted on the people of Gaza right now, that many more Palestinians may well be radicalised after this. And whether they join Hamas or another militant group, there could well still be a threat to Israel.
Absolutely. And radicalisation is a long-term process. But what we know for sure is that there's a significant risk of an acute and severe humanitarian crisis developing in the Gaza Strip. This was already an extremely densely populated area. Israel has basically moved 1.1 or encouraged 1.1 million civilians to leave northern Gaza, to leave to southern Gaza. So that means that Gaza's civilian population is now even more cramped in to southern Gaza. And there's all sorts of questions about whether the fighting will then extend to southern Gaza. If Israel hasn't found Hamas's command and control center at Shifa Hospital, that means it might want to look somewhere else. And there's already talk. You've heard Ehud Olmert, for example, Israel's former prime minister, say, actually, Hamas's command and control center is in southern Gaza. So there's this question, will Israel then extend and expand the war to southern Gaza? And what will that mean for the civilian residents of the Strip? I think in the short term, you're looking at the very least at a humanitarian crisis. And as you say, in the long term, significant radicalization, and indeed some tentative polls showing increased support for Hamas and justification for those horrible attacks that happened in early October that, of course, started this whole thing.
And there is the question as well of the kind of language I think that Palestinians are using right now to describe the way that they've been pushed out of the north of Gaza. And as you say, that may extend into the south as well. Palestinians talking about an ethnic cleansing, talking about a second Nakba, a repeat of 1948, the catastrophe where many of them were displaced, hundreds of thousands of people. I wonder whether you think now that is Israel's intention, to push the Palestinians out of the north of Gaza, not just in the short term while this war goes on, but perhaps in the longer term as well.
Well, it isn't just the Palestinians talking about this. Remember that Israel's agriculture minister, Avi Dichter, recently said in an interview, what we're doing in northern Gaza is Nakba 2023, which was a really astounding statement because, Israel actually denies that the Nakba took place in the late 1940s. So to say we're doing it again in 2023 and to have a government minister say that is really out of the ordinary. So I think what we're seeing at the moment, I think it's important to note that it's not ethnic cleansing until Israel doesn't allow those Palestinians back. For the time being, it's kind of a forced dispersion. The long-term question is whether this is ethnic cleansing or not, and that depends on Israel's medium-term behavior. If it does actually allow Gaza City to be resettled by those Palestinians, then this is kind of a short-term measure. It's not very pleasant, but it's not ethnic cleansing. If Israel actually says, yeah, our long-term plan is to depopulate northern Gaza and to create a buffer zone, then I think you know that the case that this isn't ethnic cleansing is on significantly thinner ice. But then the question is also, what will this achieve in the long run? If Israel does push the Palestinians back, creates that acute humanitarian crisis, it will probably end up having to create military bases and possibly even civilian settlements on its new border, which will mean that it's just got another a situation exactly the same as what happened on October the 7th again. As soon as you push the border back, you can't stop the fighting, you just move it somewhere else. So this is not actually a political solution. This is simply a attempt to create a new military status quo. But very often it looks a lot like the old status quo of having civilian and military settlements on a border that are surrounded by Palestinian civilians, including many of whom support Hamas and Hamas operatives.
There are lots more questions I'd like to ask you, but unfortunately we're out of time. I want to thank you very much indeed. Rob Geist Pinfold talking to us there from Durham University.
Thank you.